Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And we are hyped. We are hyped.
We're excited.
We're back in the bistro.
Yeah.
And we just had
Bistro
a
East.
wonderful lunch together
Bistro.
at the Bosphorus Cafe
Yeah.
here in
Shout out to Turkey, eh?
Turkey A? What is that?
How do you
It's like
pronounce
Canadian?
it now? They've changed it. They've changed the name of Turkey. You didn't know this?
No.
I'm serious.
I feel like you're gaslighting me right now.
I'm not.
So it's no longer Turkey.
Turkey A, something like that. It's spelled different. They had it there at the place. It was nice though. We had had some lentil soup, had some,
Lentil soup, some
kofta kebab, and
yeah. I had some what's the bread? Did you have some of that?
pita. I did not,
Why is that?
because I can't have wheat. You know that.
Anyway,
me a hard time.
so we're giving each other a hard time here. So we had a great lunch together. We're
Yeah.
back in the bistro.
Yeah, we are.
And we are continuing our conversation
Yes.
on Revelation.
Hope this Revelation series has been good. Hope you've enjoyed it. We've got some more to come because we're going to go into the 7 trumpets as well. And the reason I wanted to do these two together is kind of see this pattern I'm talking about with the 7s. So we finished up the 6th seal last week, and I think you'll agree with me, Ryan, that kind of looked like the end of the world, right? I mean, you've got the moon turning to blood, the sun turning dark, the
Islands moving around,
stars falling from the sky, the earthquake, all of the powerful people asking the mountains to fall on them, all this kind of stuff. So we get that, and we haven't gotten the 7th seal yet,
Right.
and that will be in the beginning of chapter 8. But all of chapter 7, we get this kind of interlude. And this is one of those things that becomes very tricky about the book of Revelation. We've talked about chronology a lot, but look at just the first 2 words of chapter 7 in the book of Revelation. It says, after this. In Greek, it's meta, tautu, and basically it's kind of a breaker here, right? But after this, you think that sounds very chronological, right? These things happened, and then these other things happened. But it becomes clear, before we get too far into chapter 7, it becomes clear that it's going back and talking about those 4 seals that we talked about 2 weeks ago, the
Right.
4 horsemen.
Right.
Because it says that this angel, well, go ahead and read verse 1. Go ahead and read that for us.
After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or on any tree.
Okay, so this idea of those 4 winds, then, and when we talked about the different directions, this is kind of the idea of the whole earth. This is again, you can kind of see this is God's sovereignty, and it's holding back those things, those 4 winds that are going to harm the earth.
Okay, so it's the 4 horsemen are being held back here?
That's the way I understand it, and others understand this as referring to that. There are others that understand this differently. There are some who take this chronologically as referring to another thing. But what I think we have going on here in chapter 7 is it's talking about how God's people fare during that period of time when we have this judgment coming upon those who are oppressing them. In other words, how do God's people escape? Escape. We've said that before. It's not really the right word, right? But how do we survive in the midst of all of these things? And so that's the focus here. So I think we're seeing the same events. I mean, that's not even the right word, but the same situation from these 2 different perspectives. One is from the side of judgment, and this other one has to do with the side of, let's say, protection of God's people, or the sealing is the word that they use. They're sealed, and so that's what I think we're seeing here. That these 4 spirits refer to this idea of 4 angels. We could say this kind of an idea. The 4 horsemen that we saw at the very beginning. So that's how I would understand this. This is preventing them. It's just they're holding back this harm until something else can happen. And the thing that is going to happen is the sealing of God's people, so that they're able to come through this judgment on the get through to the other side. Essentially, is the way I would put it.
Okay.
So go ahead and read verses 2 and 3.
Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. He called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had given power to harm the land and the sea. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God.
So you see why I'm saying this kind of goes back, and it's saying all this judgment that we read about in the last chapter is held back until God's people are safe. And that might be kind of a way to think about it, is that if you read chapter 6, it might seem like a very frightening situation, even if you're one of God's people. Oh, look, this is pestilence and death and warfare and conquest. But the idea is that God's people are kept by Him. He's able to keep them safe even in the midst of these tragic events.
But how should we think of safe here?
Right. It is, well, and I think spiritually safe is kind of what I would say. That we are able to stand in the midst of these trials in a way that's not going to cause us to lose our faith, in a way that's not going to cause us it's like Jesus' statement, right? When He says, don't fear the one who can kill the body. Instead, you have reverent fear, I think, for the one who can cast the whole body into hell, right? The whole idea is that there's a way we are kept spiritually in the midst of these trials and tribulations that happen around us. A little bit like, I just thought of another, of course, this is from the Gospel of John, but this other thing that Jesus says, we mentioned it when we talked about the whole idea of victory and overcoming the K.O. You remember at the very end of the upper room discourse, if you read John chapters 13 through 17, Jesus spends a lot of time preparing His disciples for this idea. It's going to get bad. I'm getting ready to die. You're going to watch me die. But He says there's coming a time where the very people who kill you are going to be thinking they're doing a service for God, right? And He says it's like we talked about a little bit last week, that if you follow Jesus, part of our following Him is in that suffering, right? And here's how Jesus says it: the world hated me, the world's going to hate you as well. If you follow me, right? If you follow my teachings, then the world's going to react to you in the same way that it has reacted to me. That's the word cosmos there, and we've talked a little bit about that's kind of the idea of the enemy. But you get to the very end of what Jesus is teaching in chapter 16, and it says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So I think that's kind of that picture we're talking about. It's not elimination of the trials. It's not elimination of the trouble. It's the addition of the ability to withstand the trials in a way that our faith remains intact.
Gotcha.
Right?
No, I think that's right. This is an important thing for me personally. It's like, that we, I think this is one of those things we've talked about in a couple episodes. Like this is one of the things that really can rattle people sometimes when they face some kind of issue in this life, or it may not be direct persecution because of their faith, but that how do we reconcile the things that we suffer potentially as Christians with the nature of God?
I relate this a lot to the parable of the four soils, we sometimes call it, or the sower and the seed, and the second kind of seed falls on ground and it grows up quickly, doesn't have deep roots. So it says when the sun comes out, that's the image that withers. And when the disciples say to Jesus, what's that talking about? It says, well, it's somebody who receives the message initially with joy, but then when trials of this world come, they have no root, and so they wither quickly. And that's why I think what you're saying is it's important to talk about the fact that becoming a follower of Jesus doesn't mean that suddenly all of our problems disappear. In fact, some people will say in there are ways in which it can heighten it, because we're expected to respond differently to the kind of difficulties that we see around us.
Just like the law reveals, now that once we understand the true nature of who God is and Christ has done, we have responsibility in that.
But one of my favorite words is this idea of endurance, of remaining in the midst of this difficulty. I'll mention the upper room discourse again, just because I've gone through it with a group of believers. But this thing where Jesus says to His disciples, I'm not taking you out of the world, right? But you are not to be of the world. So you are in the world, but not of it. So you're going to be surrounded by these people. And that's how the kingdom of God continues to be manifest, right? Is we have to be in the midst of others as we share the message of the gospel. But that's what I think's going on with this idea of protection. So,
and what I love here is when we get real excited about the mark of the beast. I always say
There's another mark.
There's another mark, and there's a mark on the believer. And so, we try again. We've had conversation about this before.
Yeah.
We look. Oh, what's the mark of the
beast?
Beast. Well, there's a seal of God as well. And
right. So this seal is, and of course we've had these 7 seals, and you think about we said that shows authority. It shows ownership. When a king seals the letter to send it on, it shows that this is who it's from. And so when we receive this seal, so it says an angel comes from the east, another angel comes from the east. East would be like the direction of the sunrise. It's kind of the idea of the dawning, we might say. Comes with this seal and says, don't harm any of these things until God's people can be sealed. Kind of, and here's the way I think about it: identified. They are shown to be His. The way I sometimes will use this example: you get your book and you write your name in it, right? So this is mine. This belongs to me. And I think when we're sealed, God is saying, I own these, and so they are mine. Despite what happens, despite what difficulties might come, they still belong to me. So this idea of seal, this idea of being kept, kind of goes back to Ezekiel chapter 9, verses 3 through 6. Could you read that for us?
Yeah, here we go. Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been and moved to the threshold of the temple. Then the Lord called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing kit at his side and said to him, go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it.
Okay, so stop just a minute. We're going to read the rest of it here in a minute. So here's the messenger of God going to bring judgment on those who have turned aside from God. And so he says, mark, you see on their foreheads, those who are against these detestable things. Now go ahead and finish it.
This is like a check mark? I don't know. As I listen...
I can actually answer that question. Go ahead.
As I listened, he said to the others, follow him through the city and kill without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter the old men, young men and women, the mothers and children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. Begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the old men who were in front of the temple.
So this idea of judgment, again, those who are protected are those who are marked, those who are not wanting to participate in the detestable things, the idolatry, the things that are against God. This idea of mark, one of the ways to understand it is there's a similarity here in language to the Hebrew letter Tav, which is the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And there are some people who think it may even be kind of an X. They think that there was an earlier form of Hebrew that used that kind of a mark. And so it may be, kind of like the X on the forehead kind of idea to indicate God's ownership of these people. So that's a possibility here. But whatever it is, it's some kind of identifying mark.
Okay.
John calls it a seal in the book of Revelation in order to identify those who are not participating in these acts that are worthy of the judgment. Right.
Right.
So that's the way I would understand this, is that even as judgment is ready to come, the idea is hold these things back until they can be set aside, until they can be sealed. Okay. Now there are some other ways to understand this. We talk about this once in a while. Some people will take this as sealed in the sense of irrefutably sealed. And I don't know that that's the idea. I would say sealed in the sense that no one else can take this away from us, right? It can't be removed by someone else saying, no, you don't belong to God any
saying,
longer. Right.
Yeah, it's like, this is mine. Now, that doesn't remove individual responsibility.
That's what I would say. I would say we don't. Right. I don't understand it in that way. I think we are kept by God's power. I do think we can remove ourselves from that. But so I would understand this to be that He is able to keep those who are His. That's
Gotcha.
kind of the idea.
Okay.
So then we get into really kind of a controversial section. This is Revelation chapter 7, verses 4 through 8. This is what we call the 144,000. And there are various interpretations of this kind of an idea. It's talking about these 12 tribes. And so there's quite a bit to talk about here. So we'll talk about some of the ideas. If you want to go ahead and read it, we can do that first.
So you just start with 4 through 8. Yeah. Then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad, 12,000. From the tribe of Asher, 12,000. From the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000. From the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000. From the tribe of Simeon, 12,000. From the tribe of Levi, 12,000. From the tribe of Issachar, guess what? 12,000. From the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000. The tribe of Joseph, you got it, 12,000. From the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000.
Okay. Couple of interesting things here, though. I mean, we read through those lists carefully, or quickly, I should say, and we don't often notice. There's a couple of things to notice we'll say in a minute. The first I want to say is this, is that typically, as we've seen in the book of Revelation, a lot of symbolic language. It's an apocalyptic book, lots of symbolic language, but numbers are often used symbolically. Earlier in this chapter, we've had the 24 elders, and we've seen that represents the 12 tribes of Israel, the Old Testament people of God, 12 apostles, the New Testament people of God. That, Jesus chose these 12 symbolically as well, we could say, to match up in that way. So that's probably how we arrive at this 144,000. It's 12 times 12. That multiplication is the idea of, a vast number. And then you multiply that by 1,000. 144,000 is the idea of the people of God, right? And, now there are some people who take this as literal. We're talking about literal 144,000. You mentioned...
I've had some conversations on my front porch. Jehovah's Witnesses, they came by and we had a very a long 45-minute conversation about these very things. And and we talked about... I'm sure we'll get to it here, but the seeing and the hearing, like what that there's that John has heard a number of the 12,000. They didn't know who the 12 tribes were, which also led to an interesting conversation. But yeah, it's that there are whole theological positions built around this whole idea.
And they would say that these are a special category of people that belong to this special category in the age to come, right? That there's these 144,000 that are set apart.
They're in the super heaven.
For them because of their own actions, because of their own deeds. They're kind of these witnesses that are, that's where they get their name, right? Jehovah's Witnesses. That they're out there doing these things that they're supposed to do, and so they'll get that special level. There are others who would see this as a literal number of Jewish people who are saved in one way or the other, either that they come to Christ in a normal way and there's this special group of them, or that they are those who are reserved, who don't believe, Jews who don't believe in the Messiah, but at the time of Jesus' second coming will believe that he is who he claims to be. So some future event that's going to take place. And so this is a literal number there as well. There are some indications, however, that this shouldn't be taken literally. One is the evenness of it, right? Even in the Old Testament, if you go back to the book of Numbers from the very beginning, these tribes were not all equal in size. And so to have 12,000 exactly that come from each of the 12 tribes is kind of a stretch, I think.
Well, and Benjamin's basically decimated as well as we come through this as well.
There's that. And we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But yeah, there's these tribes and even the missing tribes, right? The 2.5 tribes that we don't have, that they are on the other side of the Jordan. We sometimes call them the lost tribes of Israel, right? But that's one of the things that we should be careful about. Here's the other thing is, when you look carefully at these lists, and that's kind of getting at where you're talking about, even in the Old Testament, these lists are not always the same. So we talk about these tribes, and originally, of course, they're called the sons of Israel, the sons of Ben Israel, the sons of Jacob, the literal sons of Jacob, right? But 12 tribes don't exactly match up, because Ephraim and Manasseh aren't Jacob's sons.
Right.
They are the sons of Joseph. They're the grandsons of Jacob. So in the Old Testament, we never have a quote-unquote tribe of Joseph. In fact, we have two tribes that are associated with him, Manasseh and Ephraim. Ephraim becomes a very significant tribe in fact, that becomes shorthand for the northern
Israel.
For the
northern kingdom.
Northern kingdom, Israel, right? Yeah. After the divided kingdom, that becomes Ephraim. So so we have this kind of mixed up thing. Now, what do you notice here? The other thing is in the Old Testament, so you have two sons of Joseph. So how do we keep 12? Well, Levi isn't given an allotment of land because they are the priestly tribe, right? And so they're typically not put in those lists. So Manasseh and Ephraim take the place of Levi and Joseph. So that's how we get the 12 in the Old Testament. But now I want you to notice some interesting things here. Levi is mentioned, right, in this list. So you have Levi mentioned. That means that, and who else is mentioned? Joseph is mentioned. Did you notice him? You kind of did a funny thing when you got to Joseph. So that means there's two tribes not mentioned here that are typically mentioned in the list in the Old Testament.
Judah.
No, Judah's one of the first ones.
Oh, yeah, you're right. So we're missing Ephraim. And
Dan.
Yes.
Okay, Dan and Ephraim are not mentioned. So what's going on with that?
Right.
We think it's a couple of things. So Ephraim, again, the northern tribe, this northern Israel, the northern kingdom, becomes kind of the enemies of the true people of God, especially after the exile, right? And after the return, the northern kingdom kind of becomes the thorn in the side of Judah, and in fact, later they become the Samaritans, right? That really become this people that are seen as idolatrous. They're seen as being kind of opposed to the things of God. So Judah, in fact, that's where the name Jew, what we say after the time of Ezra, Jew comes from this idea of a resident of Judea, which is where Judah, this tribe, their allotment of land becomes known as Judea in the New Testament period. So Ephraim makes sense that they would kind of be the ones who are the opponents. They're not, and it even goes back to the divided kingdom. So you remember when that kingdom divided, you had Jeroboam to the north and Rehoboam to the south. Ephraim becomes the name for that northern kingdom. So again, enemies of the people of God. And here's where Dan may come in, is this goes back to 1 Kings chapter 12, right after Jeroboam becomes the ruler of the northern kingdom, then the first king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam the first, or Jeroboam son of Nebat. He's known throughout the book of 1 Kings. When he becomes the ruler, then one of the first things that he does is he sets up alternate places of worship. He recognizes that if the people feel like they still have to go to temples in Jerusalem, right? If they still have to go down, and because that's where Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, in David's city, right?
Yeah.
If they have to go down into Judah, or during that period of time, to worship the southern kingdom, then the king of Judah is going to be able to exert a control on them,
right, that
is going to cause them to come back and be against Jeroboam, being against the northern kingdom. So he sets up two golden calves, and it's interesting, in an echo of Aaron at the foot of Mount Sinai, he says, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt," right? And you remember where he set those up?
He set one in Bethel. And Dan.
And so we think that it's that association with idol worship that makes Dan, again, kind of one that we're not going to mention. That actually happens later. You might remember when we had the conversation with Michelle Knight about the tribe of Dan and the idolatry that was going on there. They were kind of then seen as the outsiders. And there's that continuing through the story of the Old Testament. So that's probably why these tribes are the ones who are mentioned here. And so again, are we saying there's an even number from each of these tribes? I don't think this number should be taken literally. I think there's all kinds of reasons to think what we're talking about, and I know this causes a lot of people consternation, is we're talking about the whole people of God here. The elders of the Old Testament, the elders of the New Testament, times 1,000, the multitude of people. Because in the very next verse, what does John see? It says,
"After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude,
that no one could count."
Yeah,
and I know this sounds funny, but I think we're talking about the same people here, just two different ways to discuss and to describe them.
Right. I heard a number, and it was 144,000. But then what he saw was a number he could not count.
Now that's how I understand it. I want to go back, and I do want to say that there are some people who take this not literally, who would see this as referring to the idea of that there is going to be salvation come for the people of Israel, and there's going to be salvation for this the people from every nation, right? That these are two separate groups, but they are God's people when we take them together. I think that we're talking more about those who God has set apart, and then he's talking about this great multitude, and he uses that to describe another truth about God's people.
So maybe like the 144,000 is like a primer for him to understand what he's seeing.
I think so.
Maybe in some ways.
I think so. It's a way to describe the totality of God's people here. Yeah, that's how I understand it. Again, I know that there's other ways too. We've tried to allude to some of those. So
gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Let's go to this next part then. Let me see. I think that was everything I was going to say about that. So look at verse 9. Just read verse 9 to me. We started it after this. Metatau two again.
After this, I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands.
Okay, so look at this description of them. Oh, there was one more thing I want to say about that 144,000. I think that's good. So look at the way they're described. No one can count them, from every nation, tribe, people, and language. We saw that previously when we talked about the Lamb was worthy because he had purchased for God with his blood people from every tribe, language. It's that same kind of language that we have here. So these are all the people who have been purchased by the blood of the Lamb, standing before the throne. So think about position. They are before the throne. You might think about the throne as, again, the ruler, and here they are standing before him and before the Lamb. So they're in the presence of the Lamb, and they're wearing white robes. We've already seen what that signifies. That signifies the idea of purity, of holiness. We're going to see in just a minute that this comes from this idea of their having been washed in the blood of the Lamb. We're going to see that in just a moment. And they're holding palm branches, which was a ceremonial way in the Jewish festivals for coming and giving praise to God. You remember that we celebrate Palm Sunday when we remember the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, but that was the idea of palm branches being associated with some of the Jewish feast, where people would cut these branches and they would come kind of wave them in the presence of the temple. Back in Leviticus, in our series in Leviticus, we looked at some of those feasts and some of the things that they were called to do then, and to use these palm branches in an aspect of worship. So that's what we're going to get into. We're going to get into this context of worship. Now, earlier I called this an interlude. Okay, so we're kind of between the sixth seal and the seventh seal. This isn't really related to either one of them directly. Interludes, you're a music major. It's a musical term,
right?
And I'll mention again the late Dr. Lowry, Bob Lowry, who was a great teacher of the Book of Revelation, and he spent a great deal of time talking about the musical aspects of the Book of Revelation. And we're going to get ready to see three different songs or kind of refrains that come out of this attitude of worship. So here's all of God's people before the throne in an attitude of worship, white robes with their palm branches, ready to sing these songs of praise to God. His book, again, Revelation's Rhapsody. And so it's that kind of a sense of they're preparing to sing these songs of truth about who God is, giving him praise and honor. So here's the first song of praises, verse 10. I'll go ahead and read this. It says, and they cried out in a loud voice. I know that I emphasize that every time, but it's talking about the truthfulness of what they're saying. It's talking about the power of what they're saying. They cried out with a loud voice. Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So they're recognizing that salvation comes from him, the ability for him to give them the victory in the midst of these tribulations and these trials. He is the one who is giving salvation. He is the one who has sealed them, right?
Right.
It's not their actions. It's his work that has brought them salvation. So that's the first song that we see sung. And then the response in verse 11, all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and four living creatures. They fell down on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, and then they sing a song. So their response to this great multitude singing a song is to fall down in an attitude of worship. This goes back to the throne room scene of chapter 4, the four living creatures and the 24 elders. Again, I think they represent the whole people of God.
Okay.
And here's the response that they see, Amen. So that's a word of Aramaic word of agreement. Amen is what they're saying. We, let it be. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen. So praise obviously is that idea of giving him back how do I say this? The description of what he has done and his worthiness of praise, the glory that belongs to him alone. Glory, as we've said before, has in both Old Testament and New Testament has this kind of idea of weightiness. Kavod is the Old Testament word, which literally has to do with weight. And so this idea of his weightiness, his wisdom, his thanks, in other words, our expression of thanksgiving for what he has done, and honor and power and strength, his ability to accomplish the things that he's done. They ascribe those things, or they pronounce those things before God, saying that you are the one who is worthy of that. And then, interestingly, anything you want to add to those two songs as a music major?
They're pretty good. They're pretty good.
Not too bad.
Yeah,
I'll scale
pretty
from 1 to 10.
lyrically. They're pretty good.
Yeah, you could dance to them or
ribbon dance.
Okay.
Or you dowel rods? Have you seen the dowel rod?
I knew exactly what you meant. I knew exactly
God
what you
rods?
meant. Yeah.
I'll put a link to that on the YouTube
Yeah,
channel.
let's link to that. I
don't know. Anyway, let's go on.
Okay, so the interesting thing is that one of the elders then becomes, we've talked about these idea of these divine messengers who kind of show these things. Ask John a question that he knows the answer to. So then one of the elders asked me, these in white robes, who are they and where did they come from? And and John responds, I answered, sir, you know, right? In other words, you tell me. So why is he doing this? I think it is calling specific attention to this group and thinking about, especially this idea of where they come from. How did they become who they are? How did this great multitude come to be? And so here's the response. He said, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Wasn't planning to, but I just realized we need to say something about that. Those who've come out of the great tribulation, they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. That's what I was referring to earlier, kind of an ironic statement that they washed their robes white by putting them in the blood of the Lamb. But it's again, we're thinking symbolically, this is their righteousness, their holiness that is dependent upon their connection with Christ and his sacrifice. So great tribulation here is something that in certain understandings of the end of the world and certain understandings of the book of Revelation, the Great Tribulation is seen as one particular event taking place just before the return of Christ. And that's when you read this chronologically. The Great Tribulation, I would see as an ongoing situation. We've talked before, depending on what period in history you are and depending on where you are in the world, tribulation takes place in various forms. I know when I've taught this, particularly in places where, and I'll go ahead and name it, it's called dispensationalism, this other understanding. You get movies like the Left Behind series or books like the Left Behind series that are very much from a dispensationalist point of view. They're going to see this great tribulation as something that is going to be extremely bad. And when I've taught my understanding of Revelation and this kind of approach, it's not just mine, right? But it's this kind of an approach, more of an Beale calls it idealistic, right? This idea that we're looking more about the ideas that the author is presenting rather than some kind of specific timeline of future history. When you look at the book of Revelation in this way, then Great Tribulation, just refers to this whole period of time where God's people are going to continue to have these terrible things happen to them. Anyway, when I've taught in places where dispensationalism is very strong, I can remember at one point I had a guy say, "Well, it's the tribulations you're talking about, the trials you're talking about are not enough. The great tribulation is going to be so much more than that." And my response was, for those who are losing their life, like you talked about the Iraqi villages last time, or at that time there had been a group of people in North Korea who had lost their lives because of maintaining their testimony to the Word of God. I said to this person, for them, how much worse can it get? Right? If you have literally been killed because of your faith, how much worse can the tribulation be? Right?
Right.
And so I think, again, this is teaching us that it is those who've been able to maintain their faithfulness throughout the tribulations and trials. The word for tribulation, it's hard to say. It's thlipsis in Greek, thlipsis. And that word is used frequently in the New Testament. Paul uses it in the book of Romans to talk about this idea of tribulations or trials that we will face. It's used in almost every author of the New Testament uses this. Jesus uses this word to describe what his followers are going to be facing. Even his disciples that are there in that generation, the things that they're going to face. So I don't think we're just looking at some future event that will happen just before the return of Jesus when we talk about the quote-unquote Great Tribulation. But I think we're talking about those tribulations and trials that we all face. I mentioned earlier, John 16:33, I think it is, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. I think that's it, Paul's admonition to Timothy. Anyone who would live godly in Christ Jesus will face tribulation, will face trials. So that's the kind of idea I think that we have here. So then I call this a solo. After the elder kind of tells John this is who these people are, he sings a song. And so this is kind of the solo. If this is a musical, he steps to the front of the stage, and this is his "Don't Cry for Me, Argentina" moment. So here's his song in verse 15. They are before the throne of God. So he's kind of singing to John about who he is. They are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. That goes back to the Psalms, this language of I would love to be in your courts day and night, the idea of being in the temple all the time, giving praise to God. I will serve him day and night in the temple, and he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Goes back to the same thing we saw with the seals, right?
Right.
That this is saying that God is going to be able to protect his people. Again, you're going to quickly say, doesn't mean that they're not going to have troubles,
right?
But he's able to keep their souls in the midst of this tribulation. Never again will they hunger. Never again will they thirst. And I'm going to go ahead and say this is one of those. I always like to look at the connections between the Gospel of John and Book of Revelation. I've said before, I think these are written by the same author. Not everybody does. I think that the author of the Gospel of John and the author of the Book of Revelation are the same person, and I believe that it's John the son of Zebedee. Really interesting connections here. This idea of never hungering again and never thirsting again reminds us of what Jesus says a couple of different times. He says to the woman at the well, the one who drinks the water I will provide will never thirst again, right? He says that he can provide the food when he's talking about the bread of life discourse in John chapter 6, that one who eats of it will never be hungry again. And that's that same kind of language. Never will they hunger, never will they thirst. They'll have their needs met eternally. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. In other words, they'll be protected in that way. And here's his reason, verse 17, for the Lamb at the center of the throne, goes back to the beginning of chapter 5, will be their shepherd. I'll come back to that image. That's probably a good image to end on. I love that image. The lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water. Now that echoes Psalm 23, he leads me beside still waters, right? But this says living water, which is a very Johannine term, right? It's a very Gospel of John term.
Very woman at the well.
Woman at the well, and also John chapter 7. Anyone who's thirsty, let him drink. Anyone who's thirsty, let him come to me and drink. The one believing in me, as Scripture has said, from within him will flow rivers of living water. We said that that's probably a reference to this idea of the temple and the water flowing out, the Old Testament tradition that the temple. Look at our John 7. We've got a John 7.
We've got a couple episodes on John.
on that. And so this idea of springs of living water that will be flowing up. John 4 is what you're referring to there, that anyone who takes this water will never thirst again, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more mourning or pain. Let's go back to that idea. The Lamb in the center of the throne will be their shepherd, though, because that's an interesting image of a lamb being a shepherd. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because the ones who are shepherd are lambs, right? The shepherd's the shepherd, and the lambs are the lambs.
Right.
I think this is an image, a beautiful image of the incarnation.
Is this like Philippians 2?
Yeah, in a way, it's that he emptied himself, took on the form of the servant. I think it's John chapter 1. He came and he made his dwelling among us. It's Hebrews, that it pleased God that the author, perfecter of the faith would be like them in every way, that he took on flesh, right? So the shepherd became a lamb, right? The one who has the power to lead us, the one who has the power to guide us in the correct ways, like Psalm 23 talks about, becomes the shepherd. And that's a Johannine image too, right? I am the good shepherd, right? My sheep know my voice, is what we read in John chapter 10. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, right? But the good shepherd will lay down his life. He'll become the lamb that's standing as one slain in the center of the throne. The good shepherd will lay down his life for the sheep. And so he comes, what better shepherd than one who has become a lamb, right? And has gone through the valley of the shadow of death, again, to mix mix it all in a big mess. But you see him saying the lamb who has been slain but now stands. What better shepherd can you have than one who knows you? And that's what the Hebrew writer says. He understands our weaknesses. He understands what it means to be flesh. So what better shepherd can we have than one who's experienced the trials, who's experienced tribulations, has experienced persecution, being falsely accused, of being beaten and being killed for maintaining his testimony about who he was, right? So it puts him in that category of those that John is writing this letter to, who are, again, being called to maintain their testimony in the midst of the same kind of suffering that Christ participated in.
And this is in contrast to the Jewish shepherds of the past. With the Maccabees, it always had come from like physical power.
Exactly.
And exerting the sword, and so they had never been, the shepherds had never been a lamb. They'd always been
from above.
Above.
Yeah, the idea of using, as we talked about last episode, worldly power rather than the power of the cross, right? The power of laying down one's life in order to serve others. That's you're right. And even, I always talk about the Maccabees. John 10, it takes place during the Feast of Dedication. That's why I think the Maccabees are immediately in view. But if you go back, we talked about Jeroboam.
It's the same thing.
Right? You go back to the very beginning. You go back to the first king of Israel, Saul. And he goes from being a very humble guy to being one who is seeking his own way, of trying to take things into his own hands, of exerting his military prowess and his military might rather than trusting in God. He offers a sacrifice, which kind of is the final straw. He takes into his hands, the king takes into his hands the things a priest is supposed to do, and God rejects him. Solomon, at the end of his life, we talked about that. And And so, even there, God says to him through the prophet that I'm going to wrest this this kingdom away from you. It's going to be split. I'm reserving it because of your father David. I'll reserve this tribe, but it's going to be the split. So all of these rulers who had come before Jesus, all of these rulers had, as you said, been self-serving, serving themselves rather than their people. Now, we don't know anything about self-serving rulers in our day and age, but the idea here that Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd," but that image. And this is what's so good about the book of Revelation, right? It's speaking truth. We could talk about him becoming flesh, becoming like one of us, but painting the image of a lamb who's a shepherd is just evocative. I think it speaks to, at least to me, emotionally, right? About the fact that he was willing to come, let's say, enter into the sheepfold. So that he could come to know what it means to be a sheep, and then he becomes a shepherd who's able to lead in a different kind of way.
It's that further inversion.
Yeah.
Like we're returning to a place that only Adam and Eve had been in the garden. It's like this inversion of what you thought you knew and how this works. That now the lamb is the shepherd.
Yeah, that's right.
That's great.
Well said.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because I mean, again, that's one of those things that we can read sometime
and
quickly. You read quickly and kind of go, oh, well, that is weird. Like now we're saying the lamb is the shepherd here.
Yeah.
Because we just say, well, Jesus is the center of the. We kind of get in that thing, and we're it's this idea of what the language is doing,
right? And that's Revelation. It's really not. Now I'm going to get on a little soapbox. I'll try to stay off it too much, but we want to make it in, and I'm as guilty of anybody about this. We want to make it into this rational kind of box to understand it, right? To grasp it, and in doing so, we kind of limit it and we kind of control it. Let's make these into propositions because we believe in rational propositional truth, right? When the book of Revelation is really a painting. I've often described it as an impressionist painting, that it's these brush strokes, little things like that, little images like that are painting for us this picture. But you have to kind of step back. If you look at it in too much detail, you're like, well, that just looks like a blob of green to me. But you step back and you go, oh, look at what Monet has done. He's made this beautiful, the lilies, what the pond with the lilies.
Whatever Monet, whatever he did.
But that's kind of how John is doing it. He's giving us all these brush strokes of these really neat little images, but you got to step back and look at the whole to really understand the whole picture. I think is what we have. I want to say one more. Any other comments or questions? No. I want to say one more thing before we're done. Go ahead and just look at chapter 8. This is kind of going to be setting up next episode as well.
Okay. What do you want me to read? 8:1?
Well, yeah. Just read 8:1. 8:1.
When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour.
So there was these 7 seals, and you open the 7th seal. We've had all the what have we had? We've had pestilence, we've had death, we've had Hades, we've had
islands over here, islands over there. Islands are everywhere.
We've had slain saints under the altar. We've had all this stuff happen, and then the 7th seal opens, and then it's silence for half an hour. And we'll talk a little bit about next week about the symbolic significance of this. But this is what I'm talking about, kind of the nesting of these series of 7s. They're not really 7s. I said at the beginning of this episode, what can happen after the end of the world? 6 is the kind of the end of the world. Then we have this interlude that's kind of reminding us, what? God's people are still kept in the midst of all of these difficulties, in the midst of all of these problems. God's people are still being okay. And then we have the 7th seal opened and there's silence. Now, go ahead and read verse 2, because one of the ways that we can think about this is that the 7th seal is opened, and then it leads to another series of 7s. Yeah. Look at verse 2.
And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them.
So now we're getting into the 7 trumpets, which we're going to have to talk about.
Yes.
So you get what I'm saying? The series kind of interlock with one another. That's why the spiral image that Metzger gives us, I think, is so correct. We come to the end of the world, and then we have the final seal open that leads us to another series of 7. So it's not
it's a Russian nesting doll.
In a way, yeah, in a way. It's giving us different ways to think about this same reality, the same truth. It's giving us these different perspectives on it, different ways to think about it. So that's just to kind of set up next week.
All right, next week we're going to jump into the 7 trumpets.
We are, yeah, and at least talk about this silence in heaven and what that's all about. So
excellent. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
All right.
Really appreciate it. And if you're enjoying the podcast, you can go to thebiblebistro.com. You can sign up for a newsletter, which I'll get out at some point here with some references and some book recommendations for this. But also, if you are enjoying it, you can support us there. You can sign up for Patreon. We also have a bookstore on there where we've got a lot of the books that we've referenced. A little link that you can click on
and share our episodes. We're getting kind of excited because we're seeing a few people that are new people that are coming on board and that kind of thing. So be sure to share it, and increases our listeners, helps get this out. If it's helpful to you, hopefully it'll be helpful to someone else as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
All right.
See you next Tuesday.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.